New York City, a place where millions come chasing dreams, bright lights, endless opportunities. But beneath that shining surface, there is another story, a darker one. A story that most people never see, because it only comes alive after dark. And in the streets of Brooklyn, that darkness once took control. This is not just a story about crime. This is a story about fear, power, and survival. During the day, Brooklyn feels alive. Kids laugh on sidewalks, cars honk in traffic, stores open their doors to another busy day. It looks normal, safe even. But as the sun begins to set, something changes. The energy shifts. People walk faster. Shops close earlier. Windows lock tighter. Because deep down, everyone knows. Night brings a different world. A world where rules don't matter. Where respect is everything. And where one mistake can cost a life. Brooklyn wasn't just a neighborhood. It was divided. Not by walls or fences, but by invisible lines. Each block belonged to someone. Each corner had eyes watching it. And if you crossed into the wrong area, you didn't get a warning. You became a target. These weren't just random streets anymore. They were territories. And those territories were controlled by gangs. At first, they were just groups. Friends growing up together, protecting their own streets. But slowly, things changed. Money came into the picture. Drugs started moving through neighborhoods. And with money came power. And with power came violence. Gangs began to grow stronger, more organized, more dangerous. What started as small crews turned into forces that controlled entire areas. It always started the same way. A simple question. Where are you from? To an outsider, it sounds harmless. But in Brooklyn at that time, that question could decide your fate. One night, a teenager walked home alone. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't part of anything. He just made one mistake. He took a shortcut, and that led him into the wrong block. A group stepped out of the shadows. They surrounded him. And then came the question, where are you from? He hesitated, and that was enough. The story spread quickly. Not through the news or official reports, but through whispers. From neighbor to neighbor. From parent to child. Don't go out at night. Stay on your block. Don't talk to strangers. Fear became normal. People adjusted their lives around it. Kids stopped playing outside after dark. Families stayed indoors. And slowly, Brooklyn began to change. To understand what was happening, you have to understand the mindset. Most of these gang members weren't born criminals. They were kids from the same streets, the same schools. But life pushed them in a different direction. In their world, respect was everything. If someone disrespected you, you had to respond. Because if you didn't, you became weak. And weakness didn't survive. What started as tension was about to turn into something far worse. Because when power, fear, and pride collide, violence is inevitable. And Brooklyn was on the edge of explosion. The streets were ready to erupt. Fear had already taken over the streets of Brooklyn. People stayed inside. Shops closed early. But what most didn't realize was this. The worst hadn't even begun yet. Because beneath the silence, something was building. Tension, anger, and a need for control. And once that tension breaks, there's no going back. It started with something small, a deal gone wrong. Two groups meeting on neutral ground. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Money was exchanged. Voices stayed low. Everything seemed under control, until it wasn't. One side accused the other of cheating. A shove turned into shouting. Shouting turned into threats. And then, a single moment changed everything. Someone reached for a weapon. No warning, no second chance. That night, the balance of power in Brooklyn shifted. News traveled fast. Not through phones, not through the media, but through the streets. And the message was clear. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Because in that world, you don't walk away, you respond. And that response came quickly. Another incident, another act of violence. But this time, it wasn't random. It was targeted. And now, it was personal. Brooklyn was no longer just divided by blocks. Now it was divided by loyalty. People who once stayed neutral were forced to choose: stay with your people or risk becoming the enemy. Friends turned into rivals. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. And suddenly, there were no safe spaces left. The streets felt different now. Heavier, dangerous. You could sense it in the air. Groups started moving differently, watching more closely, speaking less. Every corner felt like a trap. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. And most nights, it was. At this point, it wasn't just about money anymore, or territory. It was about something deeper: respect, reputation, control. Because whoever showed fear lost everything. And in Brooklyn, no one wanted to lose. So they pushed harder, acted faster, hit back stronger. And with every move, the situation became more unstable. Then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't quiet. It happened in a place where people felt safe. And that's what made it different, because now, the violence wasn't staying in the shadows anymore. It was stepping into the open. And once that line is crossed, there's no controlling what comes next. Brooklyn was no longer on edge, it had crossed it. What started as small tension was now turning into full-scale conflict. And the next phase would be even more dangerous, because now, everyone was involved. By now, Brooklyn had changed. This wasn't tension anymore. It wasn't just fear. It was control. The streets no longer belonged to the people who lived there. They belonged to those who could dominate them. And once control is established, the only way to keep it is through power. Things were different now. Unspoken rules had taken over. You don't walk alone at night. You don't enter unknown blocks. You don't ask questions. And most importantly, you don't get noticed. Because attention could be dangerous. People stopped making eye contact. Conversations became shorter. Everyone was careful. Not because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. Control wasn't enough anymore. Now, it was about expansion. Groups started pushing beyond their own territories, testing limits, seeing how far they could go, without resistance. And when resistance came, it wasn't small. Every move was answered. Every action had a reaction. And slowly, the conflict grew wider. The people who had nothing to do with it were now part of it. Not by choice, but by location. Families living in the wrong areas, shop owners trying to survive. They were caught in the middle. Daily life became unpredictable. One moment everything was normal. The next moment, something would happen that changed everything. And that uncertainty was worse than fear. As the conflict continued, something unexpected started happening. Not all groups were equal. Some were stronger, more organized, more strategic, and slowly, they began taking over, pushing others out, claiming more ground, creating a new balance of power. But power like that never stays stable. Because once someone rises, someone else wants to take their place. At this stage, it wasn't just about enemies anymore. Even allies became uncertain. Trust started breaking. People questioned each other, doubted intentions. Because in a situation like this, loyalty can change fast. And betrayal becomes a real possibility. Then came a moment that no one expected. Something that didn't just affect one group, but everyone. It wasn't planned, it wasn't controlled, but it forced attention. And once attention comes, everything changes. Because now, the situation couldn't stay hidden anymore. Brooklyn had reached a critical point. Control had turned into chaos, and chaos always leads to consequences. The next phase wouldn't just be about gangs anymore. It would involve something bigger, something stronger, something that couldn't be ignored. For a long time, what was happening in Brooklyn stayed in Brooklyn. It lived in the shadows. It moved in silence. But not anymore. Because when chaos grows too big, it attracts attention. And now the city was watching. At first, it was subtle. More sirens at night, more patrol cars on the streets. People started noticing unfamiliar faces, watching, observing. The streets that once felt controlled now felt uncertain, because something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. With attention came pressure. Movements became riskier. Actions had consequences. Every step had to be calculated. Because now there were eyes everywhere. And when pressure builds like this, two things happen. Some step back, others push forward. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some groups became quieter, more careful, trying to stay under the radar, but others did the opposite. They became louder, more visible, because in their world, backing down wasn't an option, and showing strength was the only way to survive. Fear was still there, but it had changed. Before, people feared the streets. Now they feared unpredictability, because no one knew what would happen next. Would things calm down, or was something bigger coming? That uncertainty created tension everywhere. Pressure from outside started creating cracks inside. Disagreements began. Decisions were questioned. Leaders were challenged. Because when things get difficult, unity is tested, and not everyone stays loyal. Some wanted to slow things down. Others wanted to escalate, and that difference created conflict within. Then it happened. A decision that shouldn't have been made. It wasn't planned properly, it wasn't controlled, and it crossed a line that had never been crossed before. Because this time, it didn't stay in the streets. It reached beyond, and once that happens, everything changes. Now the situation wasn't just serious, it was out of control, because attention had turned into focus, and focus leads to action. The next phase wouldn't just affect Brooklyn, it would shake the entire system. For months, the streets had been building toward this moment. Tension, power struggles, uncontrolled conflict. But now, that moment had arrived, because when chaos reaches its peak, something always steps in to stop it. And this time, that something was stronger than anything the streets had faced before. It didn't happen slowly. It didn't give warnings. It started all at once. More patrols, more presence, more control. The streets that once belonged to gangs now felt different, tighter, watched, restricted. Because this wasn't just observation anymore, this was action. Everything began to change. Movements that once felt easy now became difficult. Communication slowed down, plans became harder to execute, because pressure was everywhere. And when systems are disrupted like this, mistakes happen. And in this world, mistakes can cost everything. Not everyone accepted the change. Some pushed back, not openly, but enough to create tension. Because losing control wasn't an option. And when people feel like they're losing power, they react. Sometimes calmly, sometimes aggressively, and sometimes in ways that make things worse. The pressure kept building, day after day, move after move, until finally, something broke, not in one place, but across the entire system. Because when too many forces collide, stability disappears. And once stability is gone, everything becomes unpredictable. At this stage, trust was gone. Not just between rivals, but within groups themselves. Doubt spread quickly. Who could be trusted? Who might turn? Because under pressure, people change, and loyalty is no longer guaranteed. This was the moment no one wanted, but everyone had been moving toward. Control was slipping, not slowly, but all at once. Decisions became rushed, actions became unpredictable, and the structure that once held everything together started falling apart. Brooklyn was no longer controlled, not by gangs, not by fear, but by chaos. And chaos doesn't last forever, because eventually, it leads to consequences. The next phase would decide everything. After chaos comes silence, but this wasn't peace. This was the kind of silence that follows damage, the kind that leaves questions behind. Because what happened in Brooklyn didn't just disappear. It left consequences. And now, those consequences were beginning to unfold. The streets felt different, not controlled, not chaotic, just quiet, too quiet. People stepped outside more carefully. They looked around longer, as if trying to understand what had just happened, because everything had changed, and no one knew what came next. The response became more visible, more organized, more focused, the kind of presence you can't ignore. Because now, it wasn't about reacting anymore. It was about restoring order, and restoring order takes time. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some stepped back completely, trying to disappear. Others stayed active, but more cautious, because the environment had changed. The rules were different now, and adapting was the only way to survive. Behind everything that happened were real people, families, friends, communities, people who had nothing to do with the conflict, but were still affected by it. Their routines changed. Their sense of safety changed. And slowly, they began rebuilding, not all at once, but step by step. Every situation like this leaves something behind, not always visible, but always present. Trust was damaged, stability was shaken, and even though things seemed calmer, the impact remained, because some things don't go back to how they were. With everything that happened, the balance changed. What once felt strong was no longer the same. New dynamics began to form, different structures, different control, because when a system breaks, it doesn't return the same way. It rebuilds differently. Brooklyn was no longer in chaos, but it wasn't the same either, because what had happened left a mark, and that mark would shape everything that came next. The final phase was approaching, and it would answer one question: did anything truly change? When chaos ends, people expect peace. But sometimes, what follows is not peace. It's silence. And silence can be deceiving, because underneath it, everything is still changing. Slowly, quietly, and permanently. Life started to return, at least on the surface. Shops reopened. People walked outside more freely. Traffic came back to the streets. It looked normal again, but it wasn't the same normal. Because everyone remembered what had happened, and memories change how people behave, even when things seem fine. The streets were quieter now, not because everything was solved, but because everything was monitored. There was structure now. Rules were more visible, and movements were more restricted. It wasn't chaos anymore, but it also wasn't freedom. It was something in between. Even in silence, tension doesn't disappear. It just hides. Small disagreements started reappearing. Old rivalries didn't fully vanish. People stayed alert, because everyone knew things could change again, and fast. A new generation was growing up. They didn't fully see what happened before, but they heard stories, warnings, memories, lessons, and those stories shaped them. Some stayed away from trouble. Others became curious about it, because history always influences the future. Communities started reflecting, not just on what happened, but why it happened, what led to it, what could have been prevented, because understanding the past is the only way to avoid repeating it, at least in theory. On the surface, everything looked stable, but underneath, things were still shifting. Power structures adjusted, influence moved quietly, nothing was loud anymore, but everything was still active, just hidden better. Brooklyn had changed, not through one event, but through everything that followed it. And now, as silence filled the streets, a final question remained. Was this really the end, or just another beginning, waiting to happen again? Every story has an end, but not every ending feels like closure. Some endings feel like reflection, others feel like warning. Because what happened in Brooklyn was never just about one moment in time. It was about everything that led there, and everything that came after. When people look back now, they don't just remember violence, they remember change. How quickly things escalated. How deeply fear spread. How silence replaced normal life. It wasn't one cause. It was many small decisions that slowly built into something bigger. Even after everything settled, nothing truly disappeared. The streets still carried memory. People still remembered what it felt like. Not just danger, but uncertainty. Because once a place experiences that level of instability, it never forgets. Behind every headline, there were real lives. Families who changed their habits forever. Communities that rebuilt slowly. people who grew up with those memories. Some moved forward, some never fully did. Because not everything heals at the same speed. Cities don't just grow, they learn. Brooklyn learned something important through all of this. That systems, people, and environments are deeply connected. And when one part breaks, everything feels it, even far away from the source. Today, things look different. Safer, stronger, more controlled. But one question still remains. Was the problem ever fully solved? Or did it just evolve into something quieter? Something less visible, but still present? The truth is simple. Nothing ever completely ends. It changes form. Chaos becomes structure. Fear becomes memory. Conflict becomes history. But the roots still remain in some form. Hidden. Waiting. Not necessarily to return, but to remind. Brooklyn is no longer what it once was, but it will never forget what it became. Because every street, every corner, every story carries a part of its past. And that past shapes its future, not loudly, but always, quietly.